Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being in attendance this morning. This morning we're going to have a presentation by Mr. Fairweather, and what we had done was at the last meeting we had asked staff to come back and give us a number of scenarios, and we had asked for a reduction from where we're starting, and we had asked for scenarios that would give us 4.75, 4.5, 4.25. And so Mr. Fairweather will give us that presentation this morning. And I just want to let you know that we will break at 11:45 for lunch. And we do have a delegation this afternoon at 12:30, I believe. And so we'll break around 11:30, quarter to 12. We'll pick it up again early this afternoon, and we'll continue for the rest of the afternoon. So without further ado, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest from the committee? And seeing none, I'm going to ask Mr. Fairweather if he would give us his presentation. Thank you, Steve.
Ready?
Okay. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, through the chair, to the members of the committee. We were asked to go back and look at the operating budget and come back to committee. Michael, did something happen? There's no signal. Thank you. So what I wanted to do, there's several questions raised on budget process. So I want to walk council through, or committee through, how a municipal budget comes together, how the city's debt is used, and an overview on that, what a one-time funding is and how it's used within the budget, what a reserves and reserve fund overview is, and then the proposed 2018 operating budget reductions we have to come back to council with, and a breakdown of the annual operating budget for approval. So if you look at how a municipal budget comes together, it's comprised, and if you start on the far left there, it's comprised of property tax grants and user fees are main sources of funding, and those are used to fund both operating and capital. The operating budget, if you look at it, supports our day-to-day operations within the city. So it looks at how we fund our programs and any of the services we provide to the community. So within there, in the operating budget, we have salaries and wages, supplies, roads, parks, and playground maintenance that we carry out. We have some contracted services for items that we deliver. We have the annual insurance program that we have. We have debt payments, capital levy, and reserve fund contributions. If you look at the capital levy, it's an amount we take out of the operating budget to fund capital programs. And if you look at that, that money is what we define as a pay-as-you-go process. So what we're looking at is funding towards sustaining and maintaining the existing infrastructure that the city has and operates. So those are funds that we use for rehabilitating our roads, our storm sewers, our sanitary sewers, our water mains, our sidewalks, our curbs, our gutters, our roofs at arenas and various facilities. So that's where that portion comes to sustain our existing facilities. And then if you look at the capital budget, it pays for new infrastructure or rehabilitation to existing facilities and infrastructure. So in there, you've got new arenas, new fire trucks, road widenings, new bike paths, new facilities, and then the asset rehabilitation of our existing infrastructure. We also use funding for capital out of reserve funds. So a reserve fund is a planned savings. So that's where we put money away to be able to pay for the replacement of a truck. So if we buy a snow plow today, it may be $400,000 or $500,000, and we put a certain amount away every year into a reserve fund, so that in 10 years or 15 years when we have to replace the asset, we have sufficient funding to be able to fund that without adversely impacting the tax rate. If you look at the development of the budget, we're required to operate under the Municipal Act. And within the Municipal Act, under Section 290, we're required to have what they determine as a balanced budget. And what that means is our revenues have to equal our expenditures. We're not allowed to budget for a surplus, and we're not allowed to budget for a deficit. Also within the Municipal Act is a section under 408 2.1, which ties on how the city can operate and utilize debt. So within that section, it only allows the city to issue debt for capital assets. So if we look at the city's debt policy, the city's debt policy was developed back in 2014 when the BMA did a financial review for the city. And they did a detailed review. And the best practices followed for debt from a city is it should be proportionate to the size and growth of the city, its tax base, should not extend beyond the useful life of a facility, which is financing. And that's a requirement of the Municipal Act. Our debt cannot be beyond the life expectancy of the assets that it's financing. And it's not to be used for operating budget. We're not allowed to issue debt to finance an operating budget. It's not require the payment schedules to put excessive burdens on the operating expenditures. And what we're getting at there is when the city issues debt, we have to issue our debt for a specific period of time. And it has to be redeemed fully over that period of time. And within the operating budget, you have to build in both the principal and interest as an expenditure in every year that the payments are required. And we don't want it to jeopardize our credit rating. So we don't want to get too heavily leveraged that our credit rating slips. And within the debt for a municipality, because we're in a two-tier system, our debt is issued through the region. So we request the region through a bylaw of council to issue debt on our behalf for our capital projects. So the debt financing will be employed as a means to finance projects related to increased and new services to the residents. And we've done that for our post office expansion that we've done for the library, new or non-recurring infrastructure requirements. So we've done debt financing we've used for some of the Back to River initiatives, projects which are supported by a business plan. So we've issued debt in that relation for the street light replacement from to the LED lights, which the project itself generated a positive cash flow after factoring in the debt payments. Projects where the costs of deferring expenditures or debt servicing costs. So if we ran into a situation where we had to issue debt in order to fix a specific asset, we would look at using it for that purpose. The portion of growth-related projects, so as the Development Charges Act requires, we are only able to levy a certain amount out of DCs to fund capital growth-related projects. And there's a co-pay requirement from the city on those, which normally is around 10%. So if you look at this, this is where we'll be issuing debt in relation to the multiplex project for that. And projects tied to third-party matching. We used that back in 2008 for the infrastructure funding announcement, which allowed us to borrow money, and for every dollar we put in, we got $1 from the province and $1 from the feds. So we leveraged that to be able to do replacements of city assets. And within our policy, our term of debt, normally under legislation, we're not allowed to exceed the life expectancy of an asset. So if an asset only has a 5-year life, we can only issue 5-year debt. The normal trend that we do is we usually look for a 10-year debt on items that are related to non-water and sewer, and we normally issue a 15-year. We have gone beyond that on certain assets. The post office, we looked at a 30-year debenture for that. So we do adjust those terms, but normally we look at a 10 to 15-year issue date for the debt. The operating budget and the policy in the year that we do the projects that are debt financed, we place 50% of the debt payment expected in the operating budget to be repaid. And our debt limits that have been described by council in our policy is for tax supported, we can't exceed 10% of own source revenue. And for water and wastewater, it's 15% of own use revenue. If we look at the current position of where the city is in our debt limits at 2017, we have outstanding about 16.5 million, which we call tax-based debt, which is operating funded, and we have about 6.2 million of water rate debt, and that's funded predominantly out of the water user rates. If we look at the caps that have been prescribed by the city, a 10-year term at 5%, we could issue additional debt of about $76.5 million, and on the water we could issue about $96.1 million. The issue you have with issuing the debt is those principals and interest payments have to be brought back in and the money raised to service a debt. If we look at how the city's utilized debt over the last, from 2013 to 2017, we've used about $35.7 million worth of debt to finance various capital initiatives. 38% is the historic post office, or debt of $13.6 million. We have some Back to the River initiatives that we financed of $4 million, or 11% of that total. Road reconstruction is about 13%, or $4.6 million. We have water and wastewater. Most of that has been issued in relation to water rehabilitation, $3.1 million. We have street lighting, which is the $3.4 million for the LED street lighting project. And the 20% is predominantly comprised of the financial system at 6.5 and renovations of about $500,000 that were done at the Fire Hall Museum. So that is how the $35.7 million of debt that we have issued is been used. So the other area we touched on was one-time funding. There were some questions around how one-time funding impacts the budget. And the one-time funding is funding that cannot be reasonably expected to receive on an ongoing basis. So those are things like grants or draws from reserve funds that are not going to be recurring in year over year. And we get that from basically the sale of an asset or a one-time grant, or budget surpluses or deficits or one-time, and any draws from reserve funds are what's predominantly in the budget. It should not be used to fund current or new ongoing operating expenses. So you don't want to put a one-time in that's funding an operating expense that's not tied to that one-time issue. And then the appropriate uses of one-time resources include establishing and rebuilding the reserve, capital expenditures, or other non-recurring expenditures. And for non-recurring expenditures, we do have some one-times that appear in our operating budget. They're isolated in the program that occur and they disappear after they're expended in that year. So if you're to look at a possibility of turning to a reserve or some other place for one-time funding. So if you were to do a reserve draw of $500,000, and we currently have a rate stabilization reserve, and it's got an uncommitted balance of about $2.2 million. However, that's there for some rainy day issues that may come up. So when the Hesper core slab failed, and it cost us over $2 million to fund, we turned to reserves of that nature to fund that replacement so that the asset could be put back into service quickly. So if you were to draw $500,000 out and decided that we're going to phase that reliance on the one-time revenue source over 5 years, you'd be requiring today to have a reserve fund balance of about $1.5 million. And if you're to do a $1 million draw, you'd need $3 million over 5 years to phase that out. And if you did $2 million, you'd need $6 million in the reserve fund. And each of these in the chart here indicates the future year's budget impact of how much you'd have to increase the budget in each of those years after the initial draw to make up for the reduction. The other item that to note is if you were to draw out the rate stabilization reserve fund, it would come down to zero. So there'd be nothing for a rainy day in the future should the city experience any unforeseen expenditure items that haven't been budgeted. The other area we wanted to touch on was reserves and reserve funds. We look at a reserve fund as a long-term financial planning tool to set aside funds for future purposes. So going back to a piece of equipment, we buy a $500,000 piece of equipment today. We try to put a certain amount away over the life of the asset so that at the end of the 10 years when we have to go out and replace that piece of equipment, we have the money in the bank to be able to go and replace it. It's often used to include an annual operating budget, so it's included in the annual budget. So we do have some draws in the annual budget that come out of reserve funds for various purposes and various funding of annual expenses. The reserve funds are usually broken down into unrestricted and obligatory reserve funds, and I'll get into a bit more detail in the next slide on that. And restricted reserves are the obligatory, so council can't change those from the purpose for what they're established. So an obligatory reserve fund is one that's created by statute or legislation. Funds received for specific purposes that are segregated from the general revenues of the city and created solely for the purpose prescribed for. So some of the examples of these are cash in lieu of parkland, cash in lieu of parking, our various development charge reserve funds, some of our cemetery reserve funds. They're set up for specific purposes by legislation, and can only be used for those purposes. A discretionary reserve fund is something that's segregated from the general revenues of the city. It's based on a council direction to finance future expenditures to provide for specific contingent liability so that funds are available as required. We have these in our equipment reserves and various other reserve funds that we have. So they've been set aside. We do bring a report, and there was a report brought recently to council highlighting what the various reserves funds are, how they're used, what the purpose and the funding mechanisms are of that. So if we look at the draft budget that we had before you, before we were sent away to look at some of the changes, we had a budget of 5.78. In there we had base, which we're calling base as the costs of funding required to maintain the existing service levels within the city. And the darker blue is the growth, one-time, and operating impacts from capital projects. So with the reductions that we'll talk about later, if you were to look at the proposed reductions that staff have come back with, we would reduce the overall tax rate increase in 2018 to 4.25. The 4.25 is below the forecasted rate that was provided by committee and council last year of 4.29. So we are below that. Your base, which is a light blue, is 1.3. So to maintain all existing services within the city, we need 1.3% increase. It's well below the rate of inflation. And for all the other growth, one-times, and operating impacts, it's 2.95. And then the future years are comparable as you roll forward to what we had before. So if you break down the slide before and we look at how does that 4.25 come together, a base increase of 1.3. There's some growth in one-time impacts of about 0.39, in operating impacts from capital of 392. The major chunk of that operating impact from capital is the CAD system, plus projects that are coming in for licensing of software that we've already purchased from prior year of 0.47. So if you add those up, we're around the municipal price index for an increase with all those three items added in. Fire Station 6 adds about 1.61, and the old post office adds 0.48 to get to the 4.25. And we've broken it out in that fashion for the other 2 years. So we go back to that and we look at how that comes together. And we did this on a stacked bar graph just to put in some context of size. So the base is 1.3. Operating growth and one times is 0.39, which is the darker blue. The green is operating impacts from capital is 0.47. And like I said before, a majority of that is from the CAD system, and then the balance of it is predominantly from licensing fees that we've already purchased in 2016-17 projects. The Fire Station 6 is 1.61 and the old post office is 0.48, getting us to the 4.25. So what I'm going to walk you through is some of the proposed reductions, and on some of these I'll have Trish come up and explain to you some of the stuff on the outdoor pool closures. So we have some vacancy reductions, some reallocation of FT from fire prevention, we've got corporate training, and I'll walk through in details of these after. We've got a reduction in non-union COLA, we've got a 25% reduction in grants to groups, flatlining certain groups. We've looked at some of the potential to partner with the library on some of the administrative stuff. So we think we could save about $300,000. Outdoor pool closures for Soper and Hancock. And I'll walk you through what each one of those represents. So we're going to eliminate a vacant engineering position. We've reduced the number of capital projects that are moving forward in future years in regards to some of the design for road projects. And this position was a third funded. And it is a vacant position, so there's nobody presently in that position, so that we're recommending the elimination of that position. There's some changes going on within the prevention area, and we're looking at reallocating a fire prevention position into Station 6 as a suppression position. We have proposed a corporate reduction in the training and development in the budget, so we're looking at reducing across the board $50,000. We had done some increases in some training programs in prior years, and we're moving more to train the trainers, so we think we can reduce this by $50,000 across there. We had originally in the budget the non-union COLA at 1.5%. We're recommending reducing the COLA to 0.75, and that's $133,002 savings. We're recommending, and we've talked about this before council and committee, of reducing the grants to groups. We're recommending a 25% reduction in grants to groups this year, or $33,300. We had some grants that we're asking for increases. We're looking at flatlining the external funding to some of the grants that we provided last year at the same level as they were in 2017. So the Heritage Grant, Fire Hall Museum and Education Center, and the Social Planning Council. So those would total off to 24.2. I've talked about the potential savings of realized through combining administration with the library, and I'll let Trish walk you through the outdoor pool.
So as Stephen said, we're certainly looking to make a proposal for the full closure of both the Kinsman Soper Park pool and the George Hancock pool in 2018. The FTEs that you see in front of you are certainly a reflection of our part-time seasonal staff. And then as we move forward and below into that chart, you realize the operational budget savings. And then below some of the, what we refer to as the capital or building condition assessment repairs, that we've done some more work, intensive work this past year on that. But I want to draw to your attention that those numbers, and I'll speak to it at the end, are a reflection of repairs needed for mechanical, electrical, and structural only. So with the proposal of closures of these outdoor amenities, we would certainly, and have projected here the onset of 2 splash pads. So we would look to enhance the current splash pad at Soper Park, and at Hancock we would actually place the splash pad within the Willard Park area. For our assessment, it certainly speaks to providing a greater service for that residential area, and certainly from our assessment on the lands that the Hancock pool currently sits on, we don't believe that we would have the ability, given some of the environmental assessment there, to be able to put that splash pad directly onto that space. So in terms of outdoor pools, common knowledge, we're providing a level of service related to open swims and swimming lessons. And this chart really sort of does a comparison just of the utilization over those summer months when we see our outdoor pools in full swing. To remind you, we have then the 2 outdoor 2 indoor pools and the 3 outdoor pools. So then on a seasonal basis, we are certainly saturating the market with this service. But certainly this slide certainly demonstrates the capacity that we have within all of our pools within any given hour of an open swim. And then the bottom line certainly demonstrates to you the type of utilization that we're actually seeing. So at our John Dolson pool, an hourly capacity in open swim allows us to be at almost 250 patrons, and as you can see on an hourly basis, we're not quite hitting that utilization. So overall, within the outdoor pools, across for open swims, it's about on average an 8% uptake, and then comparably within our indoor pools, only 13%. But again, I believe that's because as well we're saturating the market with this service. On another high-level note, we've had a look at our uptake of our swimming lesson components in terms of utilization. So again, the amount of spaces we're providing, and again, the uptake from residents. And swimming lessons are coming in below 50% uptake at our outdoor pools. And we have data that certainly will demonstrate that as well across a 4-year period. So with that picture, then it certainly in the next slide does bring to the realization that our ability to, for the outdoor pools to recover its operating costs is certainly at a low percentage, coming in at 17%. And certainly our ability in our indoor pools is at 57%, and we know we can certainly see some improvement in that as well. So I leave you with that final piece and some of the real story that comes with these beloved aged amenities in our community. All of these pools were built in the mid-1970s and have served our community well. Our ability now to maintain them going forward in the future is really going to have to be given some strong consideration. Parks, Recreation and Culture, along with our asset management team, worked this past year and had an external firm come in and provide what we industry sector know as building condition assessments. So Walter Fetty provided that service and provided reports on all of our key facilities, including our outdoor pools. But again, these assessments were only based on the structural, mechanical, and electrical. So in those capital numbers that you saw in the first slide, those are the required investments that we need to make over the next coming years into our outdoor pools in order that they just continue to remain operational and viable. I want to bring to your attention that this does not address any of the AODA deficiencies that we are faced with these structures. Accessibility is a very key level of service for our community, and our ability to bring those that level of design into our outdoor pools is a bit of a challenge. It will require extensive investment, probably upwards of for each pool well over $600,000 in order to bring them up, the change room components up to the standards that are outlined in the AODA. The other component to consider is the lands in which our outdoor pools sit on. Some of our ability to be able to do this work in terms of bringing these change rooms up to the standard, we don't have the footprint to be able to do that work. We don't have the ability to expand beyond the parameters in some cases where these pools are situated. So we certainly leave you with some of that information, and it is very important for us to consider as we look at the future and the operation of our outdoor pools.
Thanks for your presentation there, Tricia. And just before you leave, just to the committee, are there any questions of Tricia in the presentation in relation to the pools? I do have one, Tricia, and that is, we talked a little bit about the full-time equivalent staff, and if we go from pools to splash pads, what about our staff? How does that impact our staff?
From a full-time perspective, there's no direct impact to our full-time staff. We share a complement of our operational staff. As those pools come on into the summer, they certainly embed that into their work. Primarily, it's complemented by a seasonal team.
And so that would mean that we wouldn't have the part-time or seasonal staff that we normally have.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions of Tricia? Councillor Devine.
Not necessarily Trish, of Stephen. If we go to, there's no numbers on them. Reallocation of FTE from prevention to Station 6, what is that? Fire?
Yeah, that's within the fire department. There's a vacant prevention position that's going to be repurposed into one of the fire positions for the new station.
So it's current vacancy?
Yes.
We're not moving anybody?
No.
Okay, thanks.
And thanks. Just before you continue, I know we jumped ahead to you, Stephen, and so now if there are questions of Stephen in relation to the presentation that he did on how we get to a reduced budget, this is the time for the committee to ask, and it's an opportunity for us to really take a look at what's been presented. And some of the things that I think we need to consider is that this is a council that we've come together and we started at 5.27%. And that's a pretty high rate for taxpayers, and I think we all share that. And we asked staff to come back with these scenarios, and these are the recommendations. In light of the decision that we made earlier this week, it should come as no surprise to us that future tax rates will be high for the City of Cambridge. We've just approved entering into a memorandum of understanding with Moorgard in relation to a non-aquatic sports facility. So we have to keep that in mind too. So tax rates are not going to be on a downhill slide, which is what we would rather see. They will continue to increase. However, as a corporation, we can become more effective and efficient in our fiscal responsibilities as we work together. And I think this is what staff have done by trying to come together with these different scenarios. What has been presented is difficult. However, in collaborating some of the services and reducing the expenditures in others, we can reduce the 2018 tax increase significantly. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are all sustainable reductions. Is that correct?
Yes.
However, this requires this committee to make some very difficult decisions, but necessary decisions. And unfortunately, we have to say no. And that's not something this council or this committee has done very well. We have to say no to some things. And none of us like to say no because it's not a nice word. And it means that some of the requests will not be granted and may be unpopular. But we must remember, we are nearing the breaking point for the taxpayer because they are the ones who are footing the bill. And In reaching these scenarios, all departments within the corporation have been impacted. All of us have a part in reducing the increase for 2018. So I think it's really important that we look at the scenarios that have been presented, the scenario that has been presented. Can we live with that? And again, I think it's important that we make some difficult decisions here today, that we're going to have to learn to say no, but we're also one combined team, and we have to remember that we all need to work together to get to that common goal of keeping the tax rate to the lowest possible while providing the best possible services for the community. So with that, I'm going to open it up and ask for questions of Mr. Fairweather. Questions of the committee to Mr. Fairweather. And sorry, folks, I can't see. I haven't got the screen that indicates if anybody wants to speak, so you just have to raise your hand. Councillor Reid.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. When I'm looking at the flatlining of the 3 external funding, I also wonder, do we not externally fund the Chamber of Commerce, and is it flatlined as well?
That's correct. It would be part of that flatlining.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? We've seen what's been recommended. What's been recommended in the presentation by Mr. Fairweather. Other questions? Sorry, George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start. I did ask Mr. Fairweather for a copy of the current financial statements, the interim statement. I didn't receive those. So I wanted to get those because I just wanted to see where the city was year to date. But looking at the financials that we have, that were given to me, that was sent when I requested that of Mr. Fairweather, he did send them to me. I spoke about that briefly at the last time we got together. But I had more of an in-depth look at the whole thing. And when I look at it and I see that we have about $800 million worth of assets, this is book assets. For those people that understand accounting, book assets are a depreciated asset base. I really believe that probably the city's worth closer to $1 billion rather than $800 million. Having said that, of the $800 million, we've got $250 million in current assets. Current assets comprised of cash, receivables, investments. A lot of money that is sitting there. The taxpayer might want to have a piece of that. I look at our total debt of an $800 million book asset. We have debt of $26 million. And that the debt load we have of what we could have in debt is about 1/8 of what our capacity would be. I'm saying, wow. I look at the repayment of debt we have currently over an 8-year period of $3 million a year. To me, that's 4% increase in taxes, boys and girls. That's a saving that we could extend that. We could do things with that, and we're not. We're just paying it off. I look at the operations that happened between 15 and 16. We actually saved $3 million of operations. When I look at the income statement that we have, that's another 4% that somewhere could be applied to help the taxpayer out. And I'm talking on behalf of the taxpayer here, believe me I am. I look at the other income that we generated. Other income increased year over year. Again, I look at what that increase was and how it could be applied. I haven't seen the current stuff, so I can't comment. But if I look at what's happened in the last 2 years, we certainly have room to reduce the tax base by percentages again. Then I look at our reserves. In our reserves, we have $70 million of reserves. I would like to know, and it was touched on briefly by this morning, I really don't know which is obligatory and which is discretionary of the 7 million. I would like to get that information, but let me just carry on. I look at those reserves, and we have an investment base to offset those reserves of $70 million too. And that's our cost base of $70 million. But you know, our market value on those investments is less. Like, who the hell is working or looking after the investment base we got? I mean, if you invested $70 million at 1%, we're going to make some money here, folks. I don't see why we're losing money on it. Why our market value the last 2 years was less than our book value in what we have in our investment base. Personally, just crazy. Then we have cash, $49 million. What do we need the cash for? If we've got reserves and we've got an investment base to offset that, even though the investments aren't holding what they are, why do we need this cash for? Why don't we just use some of this cash and pay down some of these things and do some benefit to the taxpayer going forward? At any rate, if I could get some questions answered with regard to what's obligatory and what's discretionary, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm a CPA. I love financial statements, and I look at that. And I twist them around and everything, but I'm just looking at what the people you hired, and these are the same people that have the same licensing as I do, that they presented. And this is what their statements are saying. And guys, we've got to read that, and we've got to interpret it, and we owe something to the taxpayers out in the street to give them a benefit of some of the assets bases we have. What I'm suggesting through all this, I don't think we should have any increase at all in our taxes at all for this year. That would be my suggestion. I understand that there's a cost of living of 1.7. There's the MPI, a little higher. I could probably live with that. But as a taxpayer of the city myself, you know, when I look at the figures we've got, there's some real big questions here. And I think we have to look at what our asset base is and where we're going with this. And we got to do things a little smarter. Thank you very much.
So, Mr. Fairweather, I'll turn those questions over to you. But first, I know that our books are always reviewed by Graham Matthew, and we receive passing grades through Graham Matthew. And I know that we are restricted about how we spend money, how we spend reserves, how we spend other money that's invested through the Municipal Act. But I'll turn it over to you for further explanation, please.
The numbers that he's referring to, I've put up on the screen here, and there's quite a difference between what Mr. Shevsky's referring to and the way a municipality operates. And no insult to Mr. Shevsky. The investments and the cash, we have a significant cash balance because we're unable to buy good investments that are yielding beyond what I can yield with our financial institution at the bank. So with our institution at the bank, I can get well in excess of a 180-day note. We're also restricted on what we can invest in. Unlike a corporation, we're very restricted on the type of investment material that we can acquire. We don't go into corporate bonds. We don't go into speculative paper. We're mainly into T-bills with financial institutions and government and federal and provincial government paper. So we're not into GM bonds, which provide higher yields because we're not allowed to go into that sector of investment. So the numbers that he's referring to, the deferred revenue that you show there is mainly our development charge related reserve funds of $30 million, and that's offset by investments and cash and equivalents. So it's a combination of both that make up the securities for that we're required to hold in relation to those reserve funds. The investment note 6, the $149 million, is predominantly the investment that the city has within hydro, our hydro Energy Plus unit. The assets that he keeps referring to of borrowing money, we can't borrow money except for capital purposes. So it's illegal for me to go and borrow money to put into the operating budget to buy down the tax rate. It's strictly illegal for us to do it. We're not permitted under the Municipal Act to do that. We're only allowed to borrow for long-term capital-related assets. If we continue down to the statement that he's referring to, which is the revenues and expenditures, you can see we budgeted in this statement for about $164 million in revenues. We didn't hit it. We came up at $163 million. So our revenue wasn't in 2016 the same as what we had budgeted. Also down below we have expenses of 181. Yeah, we came in slightly less at 177. But if you're reading the statements that he's referring to, we had a loss of about $14 million in the statements if you look at the financial statements. And that's offset by some of the other items down below which come in, which is deferred revenue, which comes in to finance our capital project. Deferred revenue recognizes the fact that when we spend money on a capital project related to a development charge asset, we draw that revenue in and recognize it to the extent of the expenditure. So that's where the deferred revenue in, and that's why it's fluctuating up and down. It depends on how much revenue you spend on capital-related works or development-related assets. The government transfers, again, just like all municipalities, the government transfers predominantly is our gas tax funding. We receive gas tax funding of about 3.8, I believe it is, $million a year to fund capital works, and it sits into a deferred account until we actually spend it. So as we spend that and incur the expenses above, that revenue flows in. Donated assets, they're not really a donated asset to the municipality. We have to recognize it for PSAP purposes. They don't have a real great value for us. I can't go and sell somebody a pumping station. I can't sell a water treatment plant. Nobody wants to buy a road or a sidewalk or streetlights. But according to the legislation of PSAB, when we inherit a subdivision from a developer, we're required to put a value on those assets and then depreciate them. So that's what the $15.9 million represents. The 5.9 is our share of the operations on consolidation of Energy Plus. And the interest is the interest on reserve funds of $1.2 million. So when you add all those together, yeah, we have a growing accumulated surplus, but the $16 million is predominantly the donated asset value to the city. So there's not a lot of money there to be used to buy down the tax rate. And we budget differently. Depreciation is a factor that's factored into the statements. It doesn't appear in the budget. Interest is on the expense side of this statement. Principal shows on the balance sheet side. However, for budget purposes, principal and interest have to be raised as an expenditure. So there's a lot of differences that go into play between the two statements to get us to where we're at. So from that, yeah, the statements, we're in good financial position on our financial statements, but from budget, what we presented before you represents what's required to operate the city on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Stephen. And would you just explain what PSAP is for us, please?
It's Public Sector Accounting Board standards that we have to follow, and they're prescribed on the way we have to treat certain objects. And if you go back to the balance sheet here, you'll see that we have a line in there called Future Employee Benefits. That's a requirement of where we have to recognize the city's obligation for benefits that we provide to employees and to post-retirement. So based on an actuarial, we're required to get an actuarial valuation every 3 years on that. And he stipulates how that gain or loss from the last actuarial valuation factors in to be recognized in the statements. If we were to look at what our obligation was at the end of 2016, we have an obligation of about $63 million. If you go to the sick leave reserve fund, we probably have $7 or $8 million sitting in there. So we're a little short on our funding if we were to cease operations on our post-employment benefits according to PSAP.
Thank you. And PSAP is a provincially mandated legislation?
Yes.
Questions? I think Councillor Reid, did you have another question? Okay. Other questions for Mr. Fairweather? George, you have another question?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to respond to Mr. Fairweather, only because, I understand where he's coming from, but I think there's another point of view. And we talked about, particularly, if somebody donated something to me, into my business, I'm going to tell you, and it would increase my asset base because it's increasing my surplus. So, if this was, I used this example the last time I was here, that if we take out the millions and just call it, this is a family that's got a total value of $800,000, including their house and investments. If somebody came along with $15,000 and put a pool in my backyard, if that was my house, I think that would be great. Hey, we've just got more things that we can offer people. We've got more roads, we've got more sewer systems, we've got more something that make the value of what the city is that much higher. So it's not something that sends you backwards. It's something that should be lifting you up. I look at things like, Mr. Fairweather mentioned these future benefits to employees. My goodness, we got $150 million worth of liabilities. We got current assets of almost 250. We have an excess. We've got cash sitting of almost $50 million that we could be using, that's sitting there. Why have we got such a big cash base? I don't get it. Some of this just does not make sense to me. I understand that Mr. Fairweather is talking about, well, this is what a cash flow basis I need to do the budget today, but here's my financials. Well, lordy, we have to tie in these two things together and the theories of these two things in there. And we have to tie it in so the taxpayer wins on this thing. And right now, I don't see the taxpayer winning on it. And I'm sorry, I'm using the experience I have and the education I have to make these comments. Straight and forward. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And I know, Mr. Fairweather, you're gonna explain that. But Steve, can you just explain to us that $50 million cash that George has talked about and the commitment that we have to those funds?
The investments in cash have to match off to what we call our reserves and reserve funds. So we match that off. It happens that I can, through negotiations with our financial institutions, we're able to get a significant interest rate on short-term cash that we leave with them. And it's far in excess of a 180-day note that I could buy out in the public. Also, we're restricted based on the type of investments that we can make, and they don't come up all the time on the type of investments we can buy. When they're there, we buy large chunks. We'll buy $5 or $10 million of an issue if we think it's good. But the rates are not where they used to be years ago on a long-term float. And we try to monitor putting out long-term money with the potential change in the interest rates. So it's always a game of cat and mouse that you play on trying to make sure you're not buying an investment that's going to go down, and you want it to be secure. So we don't buy any risky type of investment. So we don't go into any non-financial institution commercial paper. So we'll buy the big bank paper, CIBC, Royal Bank, TD, all of those papers and notes we'll buy. We'll buy federal-backed money. We'll buy the provincial papers that are issued. But we don't go into the corporate paper. You could if you want to, but the risk there is quite significant. So you have the stuff we are buying. We want to make sure that when we go to use those reserve funds for the purpose that we're set up, that the money is available and still there. So that's the idea behind the reserve funds. So they're there for our development charges. They're there for all of the reserve funds, obligatory and discretionary, that we have, is tied up in the investments. The investment number that he's referring to of $149 million, most of that is within our hydro commission. If you go to the note, a significant amount of that money that he's referring to as excess net financial assets is within our hydro commission. And our hydro commission, we get about $3 million in dividends a year from it. We bring in about $2 million into the operating budget to subsidize the tax rate. And the other balance we've used to do other expansions and projects without impacting the tax rate through the debt issuance. So those funds, we are utilizing them. It's just they're used in a different fashion than what Mr. Shepsky is recommending you do.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm going to let Mayor Craig ask his question now.
Well, I think my question really is more of a statement that, everybody sitting around this table is concerned about the taxpayer, everybody. And I'm not only concerned about the taxpayer today, but the taxpayer in this city in the future. We got to keep that in mind too. I mean, we can bring it down if we wish to by going into the rate stabilization fund, and we can go into next year looking pretty good. But then future years are going to have to pay for that, and I'm not prepared to do that. And I think the other thing, and George, I've said to you at the end of the last meeting, I appreciate the flavor you bring here, and I say that sincerely. And but there is a difference between your world and the municipal world. I think the way around this is, if you have a specific recommendation you can put on the floor to reduce the taxes, then I'd like to hear it. And then we can find out if it's within the framework we have to abide by. It's that simple. And I think that's the way we should move forward. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. And just to further what Mayor Craig has said, if we took cash and applied it to the operating budget today, one, we have to be very careful how we do that because we can't just borrow money to do that. But what is the impact tomorrow, Steve? So if we had $1 million and we put it towards the operating budget today, what's the impact in 19 and 20? How does that affect the tax increase? Because it's a break today, but it becomes a double hit tomorrow sort of thing.
Just give me 1 second. I just have to find the slide. We did have a slide for that we put up. So if you were to take $1 million and buy down, so we'd have to take $1 million, and I can't issue and take cash and put it into the operating budget. I have to have a revenue or an expenditure in order to get it into the operating budget. Cash, there's no revenue from cash to go into the operating budget. So the only way that I could get it in, and Mr. Shepsky is suggesting, is to run a deficit. I can't run a deficit. It's illegal. We're not allowed to budget for deficits. So I can't get the cash in the fashion he's asking. I can draw from a reserve fund, yes, and the rate stabilization reserve fund has presently uncommitted about $2.2 million. If you were to draw $1 million out of there, it's a one-time source, you'd buy the tax rate down by 1.21. However, you could do it again in 19 and take another $1 million out, but then the reserve fund becomes fully depleted in 2020, and you're looking at increasing taxes by about $800,000 or 1% to make up the shortfall. And you have nothing for a rainy day. You've fully expended everything. So if I have a core slab failure or something happens in the community that we need to find funding for, there's nothing left in the reserve fund for those purposes. So the only way to do that would be to debt finance a capital project. So if I debt finance $1 million, I'm now adding over $100,000 into the operating budget to service that debt, because I have to raise both principal and interest as an expenditure source out of the revenues.
Thanks, Steve. Councillor Devine.
Mr. Fairweather, rate stabilization fund. We have $2 million, $3 million, whatever it is. If we take money out to reduce the tax base, how does that money get replenished in the rate stabilization fund? How does it get replenished?
The money that we've used to replenish the rate stabilization, what we've done over the years is we've tried to bring into the operating budget a zero surplus or deficit. So we've been very close to break even in previous years. So over the years that we have a slight surplus, we transfer that in at year end into the rate stabilization reserve fund to build it up. So it's taken us several years to get back to 2.2 million. Council back in 2009 or 2010 fully depleted that. They drew $4 million out in 1 year, rightly or wrongly, to buy down the tax rate. The following year, we eliminated 25 FTEs out of the budget to find the funding to replace that in the budget. So the problem with the rate stabilization is you want to keep it for a rainy day. So if there's something happens during the year that we didn't budget for, you have somewhere to go to get the money. Or if we have a failure, like a core slab that happened in Hesper, we had to find $2 million out of the blue to be able to repair the core slab at Hesper Arena. And we turned to our reserve funds to find that funding. So taking it out of there, we'd never be able to replenish it unless we have a surplus. And that's how that reserve fund has been funded to get to the balance it's at.
So in other words, that's a savings account?
Yep.
All right, thanks.
Other questions? Steve, in the rate stabilization fund, what is the optimum amount that you would like to have or would like to see in there?
The standard policies through the chair is normally 10 to 15% of your levy should be in your rate stabilization. So we levy about $80 million, so you'd be looking at $8 million as a minimum balance. Yeah.
And we're at 2. Thanks. Any other questions of Mr. Fairweather? Folks, he's made some strong suggestions here today. We're down to about a 4.25% tax increase. Okay, I think you're off the hook, Steve.
Thank you.
Sorry, you're not. Councillor Devine. Okay. So discussion. I'm open for discussion. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, through the chair. This tax reductions that we're looking at here, some of them I'm having difficulty with, to be quite honest with you. Closing 2 pools. I don't think that's right now is in the best interest of the community, closing 2 pools. And the other thing is we have to look at the usage of the pools. This past summer has probably been the coolest summer we've had in many, many, many years. So for sure that the usage on the pool, those outdoor pools, is going to be down. But I just can't, I can't fathom the outdoor closure. Thanks.
Thanks, and just get Tricia to come forward and answer that. Thanks, Tricia.
Thank you, through you, Chair, and to Councillor Devine. I would like to think that. We certainly saw when we go back in our data, I believe it was actually 2015, we had a warm summer, and we saw a slight spike, but it didn't impact enough to see that we were running these assets to their fullest potential. We still did not break that point in our swimming lesson rate across our utilization rate across the 3 outdoor pools. It was at 50%, just barely. So for all the lessons that we put out, even in a warm summer, we had about 50% uptake for that. And in terms of the open swims, again, the same. The chart wouldn't be. We have that data. We can certainly go back and bring some more fulsome information forward on the trending. But I think it's just a changing time that we see for families today. And kids, I think what we're seeing on the flip side is the uptake of our day camp market. And we've really started to augment that area a little bit more. The change of full day kindergarten has had a real ripple effect through the segments. When kids are out of school, parents are looking for that continued seamless stream of care that they're used to, that before and after that full day. And municipalities have always been in that realm of offering day camp, but families are looking for more of that for ages 4 and 5 right up through 12. And we're seeing stronger uptake in that market as opposed to maybe times where past there was more stay-at-home family units, whether one parent or 2 was and available to take their children. There was maybe more stay-at-home care providers able to take children to outdoor pools when that's the primary. Right now we're seeing that shift. We've got dual families working. Often this certainly is a city that has a component of commuters as well in and around this region as well into the GTA. So they're looking to us to provide what we do, quality care for children during summer periods, but that's in a day camp stream, not necessarily the uptake once had at an outdoor pool.
We have a lot of people in the community that run day camps other than the city. Okay, there are a lot of people that run day camps other than the city. I don't know anybody else in the city that has pools for people, and I think if we have to move some of the day camps, I do think that these pools should be kept open. I mean, we can go over the facts and figures, the last year, the last 2 years, the last 10 years. It'd be very interesting if we had a chart and a graph for the last 20 years. That would be very interesting, but I just cannot see closing these pools down, not at this point. If eventually we get to the point where we're putting in water facilities, like we've spoke about with the sports blocks, when we get to that point, I could see closing them down, but I cannot see closing them down until we have other pools built for the people of this community. Thank you.
And just a comment. I'm going to reminder that the outdoor pools are really a 2-month operation. They certainly just, again, provide a seasonal approach to the services we have. We still have 2 very strong, viable indoor pools that are, and again, I believe, and as we see, the community would respond and go those ways. The approach to put the splash pads in creates just, again, a change in a level of service. The operation of pools has really, as well since 1970s, augmented itself. It, as an industry, has really become very rule-bound. And some would say it's sometimes not as fun having to go swimming. But again, because of the level of risk that's attached, we have had to as well respond. So there are admission policies, there's requirements where children have to be in the care during that open swim with a set amount of adults, and that ratio has evolved. Those practices were not there in the 1970s when outdoor pools opened. Kids, I can recall, myself, I'm a lifelong resident here. We were given our couple coins and we rode our bikes and away we went to the pool. Children under the age of 7 now cannot do that. Again, it's just, how the industry has responded to the level of risk. So it's really pushed us into a tough situation of amount of rules that are around pools and our ability to. So I certainly appreciate, I think we're just seeing a shift, but I believe Parks, Recreation and Culture is responding to where our community does need services, and that has been in response to some of our day camp uptake.
Thanks, Tricia. Just in relation to that, the pools that you're proposing would be closed would be replaced by splash pads next year, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And of the 8% of those who attend, I think your attendance said 8%. Mm-hmm. How much of that would be attributed to swimming lessons?
That was separate. So that slide I showed was just an uptake in terms of open swim and an average that we would see across the days. And we did a very apples to apples comparison. We're known in our sector for offering an afternoon swim, Monday through Sunday, 1 till 4. So that's what we did. So that's reflective of both our indoor and our outdoor for those summer periods. Swimming lessons, sorry.
I just wondered what the outdoor pool time swimming lessons were.
We're primarily seeing those during the day. Again, so it's a shift for us. Seasonal hours are a challenge for us as we open and have the most daylight time during July, but we get into August, our ability to operate past that is a challenge.
Thanks. And then splash pads wouldn't be restricted to July and August. They could go much earlier and much later.
Yeah, and they do now. And we were even able to respond this summer, again, with very minimal impact. We saw our true summer in 2017 come on in the first 3 weeks of September. Our operations team monitored that and responded very quickly, and it was a flip of a switch, and communications out to our community indicating our splash pads were still open and viable to respond to the change of temperature that we'd seen. And I know our community enjoyed that on those warm September weekends that we saw.
Thanks, Tricia.
Okay.
Any other questions or further discussion? Mr. Shepsky, George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring up a point back to our financial statements. The note 5 talks about tax arrears. We have bad debts of $6.7 million of taxes and bad debts that we're writing off. I don't understand that. That's 25% of our receivable balance, about 3% probably, I'm just rounding, of our total budget that we're going forward here. Come on, folks. We just have to do a better job of that. If we had that money, we wouldn't have to have that the tax increases we've got. So somebody was responsible for that, or somebody hasn't done his job to collect that tax, and that has to be looked at. And it's something that it's there. Come on.
So
let's deal with it, please.
I'll let Mr. Fairweather answer that, please.
Through the chair, the balance that is referring to is a provision that we have for allowance for uncollectible taxes. We budget in the budget annually about $800,000, $900,000 for tax adjustments. Those are adjustments that are a result of ARB hearings or appeals. So we bill the customer and we lose the revenue. So this year alone, we're going to have exceeded that. We've done a lot of cleanup on old accounts, and we'll probably be drawing $1 million out of our allowance account. And that was brought to council within the statement that we had presented in October to council. So that allowance sits there. We don't increase it. It's sitting there. We monitor it. We continually monitor it. The taxes receivable are collected. If you want to get into discussions on taxes receivable, we can get into that. There's a trending that we're monitoring. What we monitor is our receivable balances over the period of time from 1 to 5 years. We've started to see over the last few years a trending of our current +1 in arrears going up, which is a signal for us to continue to monitor in relation to our taxes approaching an ability of affordability to pay. So we continue to monitor that. It was fairly high during the 2008, 9, and 10, and it started to trend down. And it was got down to a reasonable level, but it's starting to trend back up. So we monitor our receivables. We don't have an exposure normally on our receivables. We have it on our contaminated site properties where we have taxes receivable, and we have to adjust those after we go through the tax sale process to figure out what a market value is on a contaminated site, and then we re-advertise that. But on some of those ones that we've done this year, we've written off over $500,000 just on one property in relation to where it should be. And we were very successful. We collected over $600,000 of back taxes on that property after we did an adjustment. So the amount is there. It's there to offset write-offs and adjustments in a year that exceed the budget, and for adjustments to receivables as we go through the tax sale process.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to add one point, and I think it's important that I make this comment with respect to a comment Mr. Shepsky made. We have one of the most aggressive departments, finance departments, in going after the amount of taxes that are owed to the city. And also, we have dedicated employees in the city that their sole job is to challenge MPAC with respect to reassessment of our properties. We probably challenge more assessment decisions on our properties than any municipality that I know of in this area. So I appreciate where your intentions, I think, are coming from, Mr. Shepsky, but with respect to the commentary on staff doing their job, We are very aggressive and take our jobs very seriously, and nothing that we're dealing with today as a result of staff not doing their job, shirking their jobs in any fashion. It's just the system within which we work, and it may be different than the system you're used to, but it's just different. And as I think Mr. Fairweather's done a very good job this morning explaining those differences, what we can and cannot do with our reserves. The reserve accounts are an interesting thing. There are certain reserve accounts, and we'll provide a list to show what all the reserves are and what the dedications are. But there are decisions that council can make and the committee make regarding how we use the reserve accounts with respect to tax increases. Just our positioning is just that we want to show what the implications of that decision would be. And so I think it's important to recognize that is the effort that's gone into and the dedication that Mr. Fairweather and his team have with respect to the way in which they control and monitor and secure the municipality's finances.
Mr. Chairman, and
just a moment, please. I just want to add further to that I know that the tax arrears have gone up, and staff report on a monthly basis to Councillor Reid and myself on where we sit as far as tax arrears are concerned. And every month we are brought up to date on homes that are going to be listed for sale, homes that have been sold because of a tax arrears. And we don't go into that lightly. A person's home is their castle, and we don't take that out from under them very lightly. In fact, a lot of consideration and care is given to that, and I want to commend staff for the passion that they have for our community and for the work that they do. And they go to every degree possible to collect the taxes before they end up putting a house on the market to sell. And I think that speaks to the character of our community, the character of our staff, and the dedication that they have to trying to keep people in their homes as long as they can and give them every benefit to try and repay taxes when they get to that state. So I said earlier that we are nearing that tipping point where that number is getting dangerously high, and we need to be considerate of that and concerned about that as we look at tax increases for the future. I just wanted to add that to what has already been said by Mr. Fairweather and Mr. Dyke. Go ahead, George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to both Mr. Dyke and Mr. Fairweather, again, if we've got that reserve of almost $7 million sitting there, and if it's discretionary, sounds like it's just sort of a discretionary thing from what the comments I just heard. It could be lowered. It's sitting there. It's a bit of a reserve that we have. That's just another reserve that we have that we have other reserves for that are covered off by our investments, and we have this excess cash. I think someone, I'd love to sit down with Mr. Fairweather and Mr. Dyke and sit down and say, look, we have to relook at what our financials are and how the city is run, because this should be how businesses are run, how households are run out in the street is no different than how this place is run. You've got rules and regulations, but you can utilize those rules and still be a little more effective than you are. Thank you.
Councillor Reid.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I just wanted to respond as well as you to tax arrears, and I just am very comfortable and very happy that we are a caring city. And we're not a business. We provide services for our citizens, and we have to look at bottom lines. There's no question about that. But we also have to look at the side of the city that looks after our citizens. And we don't want anybody to lose their property because of tax arrears if it can be avoided. And we work really, really hard to avoid anybody losing that. And I applaud this council and our staff for having that kind of attitude towards our citizens. It is important that they know they are cared for as well as they are, and that we provide services to them in the best way possible, trying to take into account everybody's needs. And believe me, it is not easy. I mean, we've gone through this budget. I know both Councillor Mann and myself several times, and it's very difficult to come to what it is we need and what our citizens need. And I know that we don't want to reduce services, but we're at a point where we have to. And it'll be a decision of what services are we going to have to pull back on. But I wanted to preface all that with the fact that we care. And that's a difference between us and a business.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. What I'm going to propose now is that I believe lunch has arrived, so we're going to break for lunch and we're going to reconvene at 1 o'clock. And we'll reconvene at 1:45. And George, that will give you a chance to talk some more to Mr. Fairweather. I know you want to have that opportunity. And when we come back, we're going to go through the proposed, we're going to hear the delegation that's going to be in at 1:45. We'll go through the proposed reductions that have been recommended by staff to reach a 4.25, and we'll discuss those recommendations. We'll put those recommendations on the floor and discuss them one at a time. And then we'll see where we are at the end of that presentation. So that's what we're going to do. We'll break now and we'll come back in 1 hour. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We have one delegation that is present this afternoon, and I think Sarah Castleman, you are on the agenda for a presentation to the committee. So please come forward, state your name and address. Welcome.
My name is Sarah Castleman. I state my personal address or my work address. Okay, work. So our main office is 151 Frederick Street in Kitchener, but we also have an office here at Langs. Good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Sarah Castleman. I am the Executive Director at the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region. We're also known as SASC for short, so if you hear that, Sexual Assault Support Center. Our center supports survivors of sexual violence. We listen, facilitate healing, and celebrate resiliency. Using an intersectional feminist approach, we work to transform systems which promote gender-based violence. And I just realized that I have control of my own slides, so there we go. That's our mission. So our center's services are unique and highly specialized. We aren't just another counseling agency. We provide a free wraparound support to survivors of sexual violence, including counseling groups, accompaniments to court, the hospital, the police station, and so on. We're available any time of the day or the night through our 24-hour support line. We support all genders, 16 years of age and older, who've experienced sexual assault at any point in their lifetime. We advocate at the individual level and the systemic level to create change. So our center is a safe place. We walk with survivors. We listen, we bear witness, we understand the complex systems that are impacting survivors' lives, and we help navigate those systems. We use an intersectional approach, which means we respect how survivors' unique social locations impact their experiences, how people respond to them, and what resources they have access to. So, public dialogue on sexual violence is at unprecedented levels right now, and our center has been flooded with requests for support. So I'm here to request additional funding from the City of Cambridge. So I think everyone has seen Me Too campaign. Just yesterday, Time magazine actually named the women at the heart of the Me Too campaign as silence breakers. So basically, the collective group as Person of the Year for Time magazine. So this public dialogue has been growing steadily for the last 3 years, ever since Gameshi, and then Bill Cosby came to Waterloo Region. And this was his first international stop since allegations against him resurfaced and multiplied. This past February, the Globe and Mail did a major investigative series on police responses to sexual assault across the nation, and they found that 1 in 5 folks that came forward to report sexual assault had their claims labeled unfounded, which basically is a classification that means a crime didn't happen, it didn't occur. Most recently, the allegations against Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood inspired countless women to come forward and share their experiences using the #MeToo hashtag. This incredibly bright spotlight on sexual violence has led survivors to reach out to our center like never before. We have been flooded with requests for support. Our waitlist for individual counseling and advocacy has reached an all-time high, and I mean an all-time high in 28 years. This list includes teenagers who've just been assaulted and survivors of historical abuse who waited years before working up the courage to reach out for support. So just this morning, our counselors told us that our waiting list had climbed to 124 survivors waiting for support. More than 30 of those are survivors that are residents of Cambridge waiting for support in our office at Langs. So imagine what this feels like for our staff members. Every day they explain to survivors desperately reaching out for support that they'll be on our waiting list for months, maybe a year. Imagine the pressure on our counseling team who are really passionate about this work, truly passionate, but they're working at capacity. But more importantly, imagine being that survivor that finally reaches out. So I just want to mention really quickly before I go on with that, another thing that our center has been working on quite a bit this year is in relation to that Globe and Mail investigative series on police unfounded rates. So in February is when this article came out in the Globe and Mail, and they found that 1 in 5 sexual assaults across Canada were labeled unfounded by police and dismissed. In Waterloo Region, our unfounded rate was actually 27%, so more than 1 in 4. In response to this article, Chief Larkin established a sexual assault task force to improve police responses to sexual assault. So this issue about unfounded rates was certainly not new to sexual assault centers. We'd been working at addressing this issue for years, but this article really put it in the spotlight. So we'd already been working as a sector on identified solutions to that issue. And overall, actually, attrition rates overall throughout the criminal justice system. To give you a sense of what that means, it means for every 33 sexual assaults that are actually reported to police, there are 3 convictions. And there was also, if folks saw the article on the Record just yesterday, that was basically headline news that less than 10% of those that are reported to police actually end up getting a conviction. So since then, our center has actually been at the core of our community's collaborative efforts to review historical sexual assault files and set up an advocate case review process moving forward. So you might have heard that in the news referred to as the Philadelphia model. What we call it in Canada is the Violence Against Women Advocate Case Review System. This is critically important work and incredibly time-consuming. I'd say that out of the last week, at least half my time has been dedicated to that, and this will be months and months and months of work. To continue to do this work, we need the support of our community. So this is just a slide, because I'm not paying attention to my slides, that shows some of the media attention that's happened about our center being flooded with requests, the requests for counseling doubling from survivors. And it has been steadily increasing over 3 years, but now it's reached kind of critical levels. So right now, every year, the City of Cambridge gives our center $4,300. That covers the cost of the rental costs of our Cambridge office at Langs. And that's telling me that I'm done talking, is it? Or 56 seconds. I can do it. I'm a preacher's kid, so a little long-winded. So we're really grateful for the funding that we receive, but we are making a concerted effort to reach local governments right now, and we're going to do the same thing provincially to help us meet the demand, because we in 28 years have never seen waiting lists like this. So this increase would be funneled into our Cambridge counseling program to ensure that local survivors have access to specialized wraparound counseling, advocacy, and support when they reach out. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about that.
Thank you, Sarah. To the committee, are there any questions of Sarah? Councillor Reid.
I don't have a question, but I would like to speak to this, if I may.
Please.
Would that be appropriate?
Yes.
Thank you. This is a crisis that we are experiencing in our community. So I ask the question, how much responsibility does the city have towards survivors of sexual assault? That is what we as a budget committee need to gauge against all the services we want to provide for our citizens. If your answer is yes, we need to support survivors and not put this onus on other levels of government, we do need to encourage the region, the province, and the federal government to commit dollars to help people struggling with the fallout from assault. However, we must also step up to ensure Cambridge survivors have the counseling they need to heal. As Sarah said, the recent events from the Globe and Mail's investigated series of unfounded sexual assaults to high-profile cases of rape and harassment in the news has resulted in many survivors coming forward. This may be because they perceive that their story will now be believed, or these cases have triggered the feelings that they have suppressed. The people are suffering is not a debatable issue. How we as a community deal with their suffering is debatable. It is inconceivable to me that we would leave survivors on a waiting list for up of a year because we have limited resources. That is a distinct possibility unless we take action now. SASC is a highly respected organization that has been in the community for over 20 years. Their work is hard, with so many desperate stories of victimization of women and men from those who have power over them. Listening to this abuse each day, all day, takes a toll that is easier to bear when shared between two counselors. It would be ideal to have two counselors at our Cambridge site, that one that we have at Lang's. Our region ranks 20th in Canada's 25 biggest cities in the report of the best and worst places to be a woman in Canada. This is an improvement from last year when we were 24th out of 25, but not where we want to be as a community. The report looked at sexual assaults in the previous 5 years, and our area has 9,259 incidents of sexual assault and 16,413 incidents of intimate partner violence. To leave these survivors without hope and a chance of healing is unconscionable. We need to recognize the far-reaching impacts of trauma. It not only affects the survivor, but the survivor's family. The numbers cited could easily be tripled when we look at who is negatively affected by sexual assaults. I urge us to support the work of SASC in our city. It is a small amount when compared to the needs of survivors. Our city is compassionate. We do care about our citizens, and we do want to help. It is up to us to extend our hand to these survivors seeking help. They cannot wait. Let's do it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. Any other comments or questions of Sarah? Sarah, I just have one question, and what is the budget for the Cambridge program of SAS, and where does the funding for that come from?
So we don't, in our budget, we don't separate the Cambridge budget, but I can tell you that right now our rental costs are about $4,300 a year there. And the salary of a full-time counselor, when you add in benefits and supervision and that kind of thing, you need about $65,000. So what we're asking is just to help support our work, certainly not to be the core funders of it. And we're asking everyone that we possibly can right now, because I've been working at the center for 15 years, and we've never ever hit these numbers. I think the worst we ever hit was about 60, maybe a little bit more on our waiting list. So to have 124, we are in a place for the first time in 28 years as a center where our board of directors is saying, what happens if we have to freeze our waiting lists and say that there is no support? And it's a really hard conversation to have. So.
Thank you. And where does the rest of the funding come from?
Sorry, yeah. So funding comes kind of from a mishmash of places. About half of our positions at our center are funded through the Ministry of the Attorney General provincially. We also get funding from a local family foundation, the Astley Family Foundation. We're actually in January rolling out a new program, separate though, restricted funding, we can't use it, but it is for survivors of trafficking that we're rolling out. We also have a contract with Wilfrid Laurier University where we're on campus 4 days a week providing support to their students. And we do a lot of fundraising. We work really hard to try and sustain our services. Oh, and the region, sorry. So I was at the region on Tuesday night. Don't want to leave them out. They do provide $50,000 in annualized funding, and I made a request for them to increase that as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. Prior to lunch, we decided that we were going to hear from Sarah, and then we would go through the proposed tax levy adjustments after the budget roadshow. And so when we look at our budget tax levy, we're at 5.2%. Mr. Fairweather has given the presentation, seeing that reduced to 4.25%. And so we want to go through each of the proposed reductions individually and get committee's comments and see where we stand at the end of that, and we'll have a better idea where we stand as far as a budget or a tax increase is concerned. So the first item on the list would be, are there any questions in relation to that before we proceed? So the first item on the list is the vacancy reduction, the project engineer. And Stephen, if you just want to speak briefly to that again, and we'll go from there.
Mr. Chairman, just 1 second. Sure. For Mr. Fairweather, would it be all right if he stayed in the seat to answer the questions? So he's not standing there. Thanks.
Absolutely. Come on. If you want to put that on the screen, that would be great. That slide.
This one here?
Yes, that proposed reduction, so we can go through that list incrementally.
The proposed reduction is a vacant project engineering position, and it falls within community development. And that's a position that is a third funded from the tax rate, a third from water, and a third from sewer. It's a vacant position. There's nobody in the position today. And with the reduction in the capital program, we've deemed that we don't need this position to be filled. So we're recommending that it be eliminated.
Questions of Mr. Fairweather in relation to that vacancy reduction? Councillor Devine.
Through the chair, Mr. Fairweather, this elimination of this person, that's my understanding. We're eliminating through this process 1/3 of a person.
No, we'd be eliminating the entire FTE. It's just
doesn't get paid very much.
But the what we're eliminating is the FTE. The position cost would be 3 times that, but a third of that cost is within the water budget, and a third is within the sewer budget. So the savings by eliminating this position within the operating budget is about $32,000.
And the same reduction in the water and sewage budget. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? The next item is the reallocation of the FTE from fire prevention to Station 6. Go ahead, Steve.
I can get Dave to speak to this. It's within his area if you'd like.
Yeah, the intent there is we will have a vacancy in prevention. We're going to use that FTE, reallocate it to the hire for the 20 firefighters for the new Station 6.
So it's a straight savings, and sorry, it is a straight savings, and the vacancy is due to?
Vacancy is due to promotion within prevention services, so there is a vacant FTE once those moves have been completed, and we'll reallocate the FTE to a suppression.
Questions? Councillor Devine.
Yeah, through the chair. As I recall, last year at budget time, did we not go through something similar where there had been reduced, person had been reduced, and then when it came to council, that person was put back? Is that correct? Is this the same situation we had last year?
I'll let Mr. Bush answer that.
Through the chair. The last year, the 2018 proposal was the removal of 2 prevention positions. There is not a person connected to this FTE currently. It is a vacancy. So we're going to maximize efficiency there and reallocate the FTE to suppression to offset hiring 20 firefighters. We'll hire 19.
Is the Firefighters Association expecting this vacancy to be filled? Is that their understanding?
I would think any association, yes. That would be their understanding. That
Have they been spoken to about this?
We have had conversations with them.
Thank you.
Questions? Councillor Reid.
How many do we have in fire prevention now?
Through the chair, 7 FTEs.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Moving along to the corporate reduction in training and development. Mr. Fairweather.
We're proposing to reduce the corporate training by $50,000. In the past few years, we put an increase in the corporate training budget, and we're now transitioning over to get train the trainer type of staffing, so we were able to reduce the $50,000 from that.
Councillor Reid.
Yes, well, as an educator myself, I've always believed strongly in training and development. So I need to feel confident and reassured that the training that is required for our staff to move forward, as we keep talking about, we're moving into a new level, the next level, that we will have enough money there to do the things that we really need to do in that particular area. So could I have some comments on that, please?
Yes, Mr. Dyke, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Councillor Reid. Yeah, we're quite confident in our abilities to deliver the service required. The $50,000 will not impact the regulatory or legislative training requirements of our staff. We're looking at modifying or reconfiguring how we provide training. As Mr. Fairweather did mention, we do see the actually stronger benefit to the city through training staff where appropriate. And we think that we'll still be maintaining, if not increase the level of training to our staff over this period, even with this reduction. I would mention it's one thing that we're very conscious of our ability to properly train and educate our staff, and we didn't take this cut lightly. But it's something I think that, given the construct that we're in right now, that we can accommodate and not decrease service level any.
Any other questions? The next item is the non-union cost of living adjustment. Mr. Fairweather, please.
Thank you. Through the chair, what's being proposed here is we had originally placed in the budget a 1.5% COLA adjustment for non-union staff, and we're recommending reducing that from 1.5% to 0.75% COLA, and that results in the savings of $133,200.
Questions? Councillor Devine.
Can you please give me an example of some positions that would be considered non-union? Do we have people that are making minimum wage or living wage that fall into this category?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Councillor Devine, we have roughly 130 staff members that are in the non-union ban, and none of them would fall into the category of a living wage, minimum wage employee.
Okay, so what would be the least that the lowest person would be paid annually?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Bush on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair, without the information in front of me, I would suggest that $45,000 would be the minimal in that category.
Can I amend this?
You can make any suggestions you like.
Well, somebody who's making $45,000 a year is not making a whole lot of money, right? Somebody's making, 150 or 200. That's a chunk of change. I'd throw the $100,000 bogey at it. Anybody over $100,000, they get the 0.75. Anybody below gets 1.5. And obviously the numbers are going to change.
So you put that on the floor that anybody making over $100,000 would get the
0.75. Anything below that gets 1.5. I mean, you need a soft somewhere. I don't believe somebody making $45,000 a year, which is certainly is not a lot of money, should be limited to 0.75%, because at 100,000, for example, 0.75% at 200,000, you're getting twice as much money. All right, at 45,000, you're getting half of what you get at 100,000. So, I mean, it's like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in a situation like that.
Councillor Devine has put forward a suggestion. Is there further comment, further discussion around the table? Councillor Hermeta.
I was just going to second it.
Thank you. And Councillor Reid?
Well, I think it might be a bit premature to select exactly what level it should be until we have an understanding of what the savings would be and how many people are at what levels. That maybe could we defer this until we get further information on that? It's not
I'd be happy to defer it until we get more information. Absolutely.
Sorry, Councillor Devine, go ahead.
I'd be more than happy to defer it until we get additional information as per the request of Councillor Reid.
Further discussion? Then what if we defer that, have staff take a look at it at the $100,000 and above and what that impact would be on the budget?
Well, I would like it to be not just at a 100,000, but that we maybe want to go lower than that or higher than that. I mean, because we have no idea what the savings may be, I think that at several levels we should have some information.
So if we went incrementally, Mr. Bush has said that $45,000 seems to be the low level. And maybe if we went 50, 75, 100, or do we want to go even more incremental than that? Councillor Reid? So can we direct staff to take a look at the incremental implementation of the cost of living reduction and get back to us on that? That'll be direction to staff then. The next one is to flatline grants. Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. 25% reduction in the grants to groups. We need to have some discussion about that. Right now, I think we have about $125,000 or $127,000 that we give to grants to groups, and we're talking about a reduction of 25%. So that one's on the floor for discussion. Then I'm going to go right on. Councillor Mehta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I just wanted to say that it's not something I'm thrilled about, but if we have to cut anything, I'd rather do it here than in cut fire or, cut services that people depend on. But don't like any cuts, right? But if we have to make a tough decision, I'd rather bite the bullet here.
Councillor Devine.
Well, I'm taking the opposite position, to be honest with you, and I understand there's a hard process for everybody. This grants to groups, this is, for lack of better words, the roots of the community. It really is. I remember the man has since passed away, Chester Rosen, coming here basically begging for $1,500 to run their organization. That was the self-help hotline. So, I mean, we're really getting to the roots of the community when we're starting to dip into grants for groups. So to me, there has to be a better way to look at some savings as opposed to grants for groups.
Thank you. Other comments, Councillor Reid?
Thank you. Well, when I consider a grant, to me, that's a one-time type of funding. And what we traditionally have been doing in the grants to groups is providing almost sustainable funding for particular groups because they come back year after year in order to do what it is that they want to do. And it's an area that I think we need to look at, just exactly how we run the grants to groups to start with, but also I think I could live with the 25% reduction to these grants, not happily, but none of this is happy. So I feel that we need to really be careful about how we give money out to various groups within our community in the way of grants rather than putting them in the budget, as we oftentimes do with groups that we find that they need assistance along the way. I just feel that grants are something we should do on a one-time basis for somebody who has an idea or a service that they could provide, and then they would not need it for their sustainable funding. They have funding elsewhere. This would be for something special.
Thank you. Other comments in relation to the grants to groups? George.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, we're looking to cut $33,000, I think was the figure. If we just had a little stronger look at what our marketable securities are and taking a look at how they're invested, so we don't have a market value of $500,000 less than what their book value is, then we could afford to give more to the community. We just need a little tighter control over that, and it's there. It just needs to be looked at. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I know as part of the grants to groups, it's always difficult when we look at reductions in grants to groups. My impression of grants to groups has always been one that this is a way in which we can help out groups within the community, and it's a way of kickstarting or getting them off the ground to help them become sustainable in the future. And that was always my impression, that grants to a group were supposed to be a short-term investment so that they could get off the ground and then develop the funding that they need to be sustainable on their own. The next item on the list is, sorry, just a moment. Sorry, Mr. Fairweather, you have some comments to make?
In regards to Mr. Shepsky's, through the chair, comment on investment income, probably 98% of the investments we hold are tied to reserve and reserve funds. So the interest would not hit the operating budget to subsidize the operating budget as indicated.
George.
Mr. Chairman, if it didn't hit the operating budget, then it would hit the capital budget. And if it hits the capital budget, then the other could be reduced. I mean, we're just playing with a bunch of words. When I see investments that we have of $70 million, and we're losing on those investments, we have a market value of less than their book value of $500,000. There's a problem. It doesn't matter where it's allocated, there is a problem, and it has to be fixed. And I spoke with Mr. Fairweather earlier. What the council needs to do is see financial statements similar to what we get on an annual basis here, because the stuff that we're getting is pure volume of data that we can't consume in our heads properly. We need to see, you could get a template very easily to throw out the statement of financial position, the income statement, and summary of the reserves to all the council members so they understand what's going on monthly here, just like a business would, just like a household would. Never mind a business. A household would do the same thing. And we're not doing that. And I think we have to change our whole perspective of how to do things. Thank you.
I'm going to turn over to Mr. Fairweather, please, to respond to that.
In response to the question regarding investments, the city is not an active trader in investments. We buy an investment at the rates prescribed and we hold it against the reserve fund to earn income. They're matched to the timing of the need of the funding. The rules and regulations within the province stipulate that the reserve fund balances must be available at the point in time that they are required. And therefore, the investments are matched over a timing period to match the needs of the reserve funds for the purposes that they've levied. As for the financial statements, I'm not aware of any federal, provincial, or municipal government that produces audited financial statements every quarter. Yes, it is for an SEC-traded corporation required as part of the SEC rules and regulations that they have to issue audited statements on a quarterly basis. The legislation that we operate under is a municipal act. It requires us to produce annually an audited financial statement. What we produce for council is a statement and we do this on a monthly basis to departments to judge where they're at in comparison to their budget. The approved budget is what we operate towards on a program basis. So we're judging our forecasting based on each of the individual programs contained within the budget. Those are then rolled up at year end to create the financial statements, and they are adjusted as we go into the financial statements for all the required adjustments under PSAB to make them compliant with the PSAB regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Fairweather. And moving on, we're going into the flatlining of grants. Any comments or conversation around the flatlining of grants? And Steve, maybe you could give us an explanation in relation to that.
The majority of the reduction here, there was a report that went to council a few months ago looking at trying to increase the heritage grant by $20,000. That's the majority of the amount. There's a small amount that was factored in for the Fire Hall Museum, and the other one was just flatlining the Social Planning Council that was asking for a 3% COLA adjustment.
Questions, comments? Seeing none, I'm going to move on to the library administration. And I'll ask Mr. Dyke to give us an explanation in that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the purpose of the committee, we've gone through and looking at the operational basis of the library as well as the city, and we think there are areas that we can recognize consolidation of service to provide savings through the budget process. In line with that, we've had brief conversations just this morning with Ms. Kelly, as well as Mr. Price, who's also the chair of the library board, and Councillor Mann and myself will be attending the library board meeting on Wednesday to discuss this with the library board and our position on the library board as well.
Any questions? Mr. Price.
Helen's going to speak to this item.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Mr. Dyke just said, this is relatively fresh information for me, so I don't have all of my thoughts put together yet. But I did want to make a couple of comments for the committee to consider. And I will say that Mr. Fairweather and his team do an amazing job of putting the budget information available to the public on the website. And in fact, 4 years of budgets are there, 2015, 16, 17, and 18, which is more robust than I've seen in other municipalities. So we were able to go and look over time at the last 4 years and look at budget information. And looking at the 2017 budget summary report, when you look at what was put in for the old post office operating budget and what you look at what we've put in this year in the 2018 budget operating summary report, the library board has come in at an 18% reduction. So we have been working behind the scenes to try to get our numbers in very good shape. We've also done some amazing things without adding extra FTEs or positions and increasing service levels. So this summer we were able to open our branch libraries, our 3 branches, an additional 1,500 hours annually of open hours across the city, and that is sustainable and that's permanent. We did not add a new position. We did that through efficiencies and through finding ways that we could cross-train staff and utilize technology in a better fashion. When I look at our overall operating expenditures and I compare the 2015 to the 2018, the Cambridge operating budget expenditure summary, we were 6.22% of the city budget in 2015, and we would be 6.5% of the city budget in 2018. That is a 0.34% increase over 4 years, so basically 1/3%. So when I saw this number this morning at $300,000, I thought that that was a rather high number. I was surprised by it because when I see that we are between 6 and 7% of the total city budget, and the number we're trying to reach is 829,000, 6 or 7% of that would be $50,000 or $55,000. When we've already been very streamlined with how we've increased hours at branches without adding a new position, and we've come in 18% lower on our operating budget over our expectation last year. So I just wanted to say that to the committee to give them some more information.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly, and I know Mr. Dyke wants to respond to that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important from the committee's standpoint to kind of walk you through the methodology we went through when we were putting the numbers together. And we fully value and understand the level of service that the library, that the ID Exchange and through Ms. Kelly's leadership brings to the community. This isn't a commentary on that, and it's not really even a commentary on percentages based on 1 year over the other. The city has made significant investments in the library over a number of years, and so we're looking at a standpoint of, okay, we similar to what we've done internally, where we've internally extracted over $2 million from the operating budget of the city for what the services we're directly responsible for. And it's more of a measure of looking at, given the increase in cost of what we're looking over the operation of the city, are we operating in the most efficient and effective manner possible? And that was the determination where we went into. The services we're looking at identifying will not have an impact on the delivery of library service. It's areas of strength that the city has to have discussion with the library board with respect to, is there a way it can be provided better in a more efficient manner? And so that's the nature of the discussion. So it's not a commentary on the service we receive from the library. It's not a commentary on the trending time over time. It's dealing with the issue we have at hand with the quantum of the city budget, of which the library is a part of the city budget, similar to a fire department, similar to all the other departments of the city. So that's where our thought process came from, and that's the messaging that we will bring to the library board next week, and that's the piece and the consideration we're looking forward to bring through to the committee and ultimately council.
Thank you. Any further questions, Mr. Price?
Just a comment. Our board hasn't seen this cut, and we'll take it up on Wednesday with the board. And through that discussion, we'll either come back and let you know that they're in agreement or they have some other ideas to lower the number. We know that you want a lower number, and we'll see which way we go at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Craig.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I went through this last night and this morning about the library. And my concern, of course, is I'm a supporter of the library, and my concern, of course, was the programming and the losing FTEs, of which this doesn't affect either. I think we have to give the board time to look at this, and I agree with that statement. But I'm hopeful that the board would come back with some suggestions, maybe perhaps not at the 300,000, but at a different level that could be given to the committee. So, Mr. Chair, I would suggest we could take it out today and put part of it back in the next week, or we could leave it all in today, take part out next week. It's whatever the committee decides.
Thank you, Mayor Craig. And are there any other questions or comments? One of the things that we've already decided that we would take out would be to have staff review the cost of living as far as the non-union members are concerned. So we've already got that item out. Is there a desire to take this item out and let the library go back and take a look at it and see what they can come back with at a later date after their board meeting of next week, I believe?
Mm-hmm. It's Wednesday.
Next Wednesday? Comments in relation to that? Councillor Reid.
Well, I don't really think we want to take it out. The non-union thing, we're not taking it out, we're looking at it. And I think it's the same with the library here, that I don't want to move one way or the other. I want to wait and see what the board can come back with and then deal with it, if that is a possibility.
Thank you. That was my choice of words. It was not to take it out, but just to review it. Thank you. Other comments? I'm sensing agreement that we just hold off on that one, and we'll move on to the next item then. And the next item is the pools. Thank you, Ms. Kelly. The next item is the pools. Mr. Fairweather? Sorry.
Tricia Lewis that would answer that for you through the chair.
Tricia Lewis. If you can just give us a brief overview again on the pools, please.
So just to recap, this is the proposed closure of Soper Park pool and the George Hancock pool with replacements of splash pads in each of these respective areas. Soper Park does have a splash pad. We would look to enhance that. The FTE and operational savings are only reflective of seasonal and part-time staff. We certainly, I think as well in my earlier presentation, spoke of just the declining utilization of our pools, both from a open swim perspective and a swimming lesson uptake. And we have seen this trend now for the past 4 years. And lastly, I remind Budget Committee of the future investments needed, not only from the work that we've done this past year in identifying some of the structural, electrical, and mechanical requirements to maintain these aging infrastructure. But what we have not yet addressed or have a understanding of is the full requirement of the AODA requirements, bringing our outdoor pool change rooms up to a level of accessibility. As I indicated, some of the locations, we will not be able to do that because these pools and the change rooms that they reside on are landlocked and will not be able to meet the requirements of physical space to adhere to the accessibility legislation.
Thank you, Tricia. Are there any comments or questions of Tricia? Councillor Reid.
Yes, of course, we hate to take any pools away, and we know that we heard last year that people really enjoy them, those who use them. I understand that they're not used to the fullness that we had hoped they would be, but I'm also concerned about the age of these pools. And I know I'm asking you to look in the future, Tricia, but are we looking at a significant amount of expenditure in order to keep these pools?
In my assessment, pools investment would be in the millions. And our neighboring community, Kitchener, certainly did that this past summer with an investment in its Kiwanis outdoor pool. Saw the closure requirement in the summer and that type of an investment. These facilities have reached their lifespan, which is well over 40 years. So again, for us to meet the future requirements and legislative and possibly other building code requirements, it is going to take that type of investment. I've done work like this mechanically to bring up to speed a pool in a nature in my prior roles that are of very similar age, mechanical in terms of deck drains, main drain replacements. It was usually in the neighborhood of just over $500,000. When we stepped into the requirements separately related to the change rooms, it too was in $600,000. So it's, with 3 pools, it's something that we need to consider. And I have to ask, we certainly have, and no different than other communities, we have aging infrastructure across the municipality. And while I know these are beloved assets, I have to put them in prioritization over my arenas and as well as the two other indoor pools and community centers. They too are starting to show age, and I have to prioritize.
Thank you, Tricia. We realize we put you in a tough position when you have to make these decisions, but we really appreciate you coming forward with them. Any other comments or questions of Tricia? Thanks. What we have before us then are 8 items that have been identified as adjustments after the budget roadshow, and I would suggest that item number 3, the corporate reduction, item number, not the corporate reduction, item number 4, the non-union COLA adjustment, we would not be ready to make a decision on that today because we've asked staff to go away and take a look at coming back with some different scenarios on the implementation of that. The other item is item number 7, which is the library administration, and we've said that we would not make a decision on that until after the library board has had a chance to look at it and then come back and give us their findings. So I would suggest now that we have 6 items that we need to discuss or we need to make a decision on as far as what we do in reducing the budget from our 5.26 where we started this morning, and that would be the vacancy reduction, the reallocation of the FTE position at fire station number 6, the corporate reduction in training, the 25% reduction to grants to groups, the flatlining of grants, and our outdoor pool closure and conversion to spray pads. So I would like to put that on the floor, and if there's discussion, we need to have discussion. If there's a motion that comes forward to accept those 6 items and ask staff to take that back and have a review and see what that potential reduction in the tax levy is going to be and come back and report that to us. We won't make a decision today at the bottom line because we still have to hear back from staff in relation to the non-union cost of living adjustment and the library administration, but we can make a decision on the remaining 6. Thoughts from the committee? Councillor Ameta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment about the last one with the pool closures. I would like an opportunity to talk to the ward councillors privately about that before I make a decision on that part of it, but the rest of them, I'm willing to bite the bullet on the other items. Thank you.
Other comments from the committee? So, Councillor Ameta, you're suggesting that we pull item number 8 out of the list for now?
Councillor Reid, thank you for mentioning that, by the way. Yeah, I just wanted to take it out just like the other 2 items that we took out, and then we can revisit it at a later time.
Seeing no other comments, then do I have a motion on the floor? Do I have a motion, somebody to put a motion on the floor to accept the remaining 5? Councillor Ameta? Seconder? Councillor Reid? So the motion on the floor is to impose those 5 categories that we've talked about: the vacancy reduction, the reallocation of the FTE, the corporate reduction in training, the 25% reduction to the grants to groups, and flatlining of grants. That's the motion that's on the floor. Any comments? Those in favor? Those opposed? The motion is moved. The motion proceeds. What will happen now is we will ask staff to go back and take a look at the remaining 2 items, and we will hear back from the library we'll hear back before Thursday. Well, we'll hear back from the library on Wednesday evening.
Yeah, we'll call you late Wednesday night.
Mr. Dyke and I will be there. I'm going to suggest that we would have a meeting then on Thursday, December 14, 9:30 in the morning. And that would give us an overview of where we stand. I can tell you right now that we stand at about 4.9% with the reductions that we have suggested. So we're down from 5.2 to 4.9. Councillor Reid.
I have two motions to put forward. One from the SASC proposal, that we add $20,000 to the budget in light of the crisis that SASC is experiencing with sexual assaults. I'm looking for a seconder.
Seconder is Mayor Craig. Comments and discussion? Those in favor? Those opposed? The motion's carried. And your second motion?
The second motion is, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a conference that has been sponsored by the city called Equal Are We. This again is another conference that the YWCA has been taken a leadership role in it to provide a one-day experience, mainly for men, actually, to look at sexual harassment and what can be done and what men can do as a part of our community in order to help erase this within our community. And we need $5,000 to provide that conference this year. It's going to be provided in September of 2018. So I'm looking for a motion to provide the $5,000 for the Equal Are We conference. Looking for a seconder.
So we have a motion on the floor for $5,000 to Equal Are We. We have a seconder moved by, sorry. First, we need to note the conflict that Councillor Devine has. The motion is moved by Councillor Reid, seconded by Mayor Craig. Those in favor? Those opposed? The motion is moved.
Okay, we got those in for now.
So the proposed tax increase is now at 4.94. And I just want us, we're going to adjourn shortly, and we're going to have a meeting back on December 14th. But I really want to stress that we came here this morning and we knew that we were at 5.28, and we really wanted to come with a reduction in our budget forecast for 2018. And there are hard decisions that are yet to be made. And I know that we've got 3 areas that we still have to consider, and we'll do that on December 14th. I really want to commend staff. There have been a lot of work done by staff to get us to this point, and we've asked staff to really take a hard look at different areas, and it's not been easy for them either. I mean, we ask them to do the heavy lifting, and they've come forward with the heavy work that's been done, and we really appreciate that, because it's not easy when you have to look at your own areas and say, are we going to fill this vacancy? Are we going to close this pool? Are we going to have this initiative, or are we going to have this program? And staff have done a tremendous job at making sure we understand the impact and coming up with areas where they feel that savings could be obtained. I want to commend the staff in the finance branch as well for the work that they've done, because every time we've asked for something, they've been able to present it. And one thing I'm going to ask the committee to do is something that George has suggested, and that is, if you want to have a look at the financial statements, please get a hold of Mr. Fairweather or Mr. Dyke and make those arrangements, because they will do everything they can to make sure you understand what it is we're voting on, and the motions and the decisions that we're making. The rules of engagement when it comes to finances for a municipality are much different than they are for businesses. I understand that, but it's important that we all understand that. So with that, I'm going to suggest that, oh, sorry, we have somebody waving to us in the audience before we adjourn, and Councillor Liggett wants to come forward and make a delegation.
I'd like to say something as well.
We'll let Councillor Liggett go first, please.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask for questions from the audience. Anyway, you know, it's been interesting for me to spend the whole day here because I haven't had that opportunity in previous years. I've looked through the budget extensively, and when I look at what you want to cut, in particular the pools, I have some thoughts on that staff might want to take away to deal with. There is $50,000 in the budget for 18S012, and it's the property on Highway 24 as you're going towards Brantford, the old mill that was torn down years ago. And there's $50,000 in that budget that our city portion would go to for some remediation. It's been sitting derelict forever. I don't think it's something that is necessary at this point in time, so I think we could find some savings there. And that comes out of the capital levy. Also, the East Galt Heritage District Plan Study, which is 18E010, is another $50,000. I don't see any great problems in my ward in that area at this point in time as far as developments coming forward. I think we could probably let that go for another year. I'm willing to have that happen. So we're up at $100,000 there already. And so that would save the pools. And when I look at the conferences and the seminars for all departments, and I look at it for council alone, I didn't go to my two conferences this year. We've got $55,000 in council's conferences and seminars for this coming year. I'm wondering if there could be some savings there. I don't know. I don't know what was on hand. I find sometimes the conferences are a waste of time. There's not a lot there to be learned. It's great networking, so I'm wondering if maybe in all of the departments for the conferences and seminars we could all pull together all of our departments and see if there's some savings there that, you know, maybe there's some things that we don't have to attend that maybe we're in the habit of attending, and I think maybe we could find some, because our budget is sky high because of Station 6. So maybe this year we could bite the bullet in some of these areas and see what we can do to save some more money. So if I could just leave that with everybody.
Great, thanks for your comments, Councillor Liggett. And what we'll do is staff have made note of them, and we'll report back on next Thursday in relation to those. Councillor Devine.
Yeah, there's two items. Last budget meeting we had, I specifically requested to find out the cost of 2017 of junkets throughout the country in various places, whether it be the States, Dubai, or whatever. I specifically asked that, and I specifically asked what total cost was and what budget it was coming out of. I haven't heard anything back on that. The other thing, as a concern really, we embarked some time ago, about the time I was elected as council, with the continuous improvement program, I believe, through Toyota Corporation. And this is really directed to the financial people and city manager. Have we applied any of these continuous improvement processes to the budget in various departments in this city?
And what I'll do is I'll just see if Mr. Fairweather, or Mr. Dyke rather, can comment on the continuous improvement program that we've embarked on, and if we have applied any of those processes that have been learned through Toyota into the finance and administration of the organization.
No, I didn't ask finance, but I said through the departments in the city. Are we using the continuous improvement program in the departments in the city? Now that should stick out very quickly, as I was involved with that many, many years ago. Okay, and that is a great way to save money. It's a great way to track things, whether it be continuous improvement, Six Sigma, or 5S. They're all very similar.
Thank you. I'll ask Mr. Dyke to address that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, through to Councillor Devine, yes, we do actively, we employ them we have been since the day one. On a daily basis, we've actually reinvigorated the continuous improvement program. It's actually CI2 is what it's called, and it's going. Your ideas matter, and so we're re-engaging staff that way. What you're seeing is some of the areas we've been able to cut the millions of dollars we have been able to extract out of the operating budget over the last number of years are a direct result of the change in processes. The reduction in the increase in the water and sewer rates, again, is a reduction of the CI program into the into areas of water loss and things of that nature and operational pieces. So yes, they have been implemented, and you have been witnessing the impact of those initiatives over the course of the development of the budget over the last number of years.
Okay, so if that's the case, those tangibles should be showing up. Like, is there anything that's been highlighted that we've managed to receive through those systems and processes, Gary?
Again, through your, Mr. Chairman. So the part of the biggest tangible, if you will, was put through was the water and wastewater impacts regarding that. The other reporting that came done on an individual basis was through the water billing program, the program we put in place to improve the problems we were having with the water billing process, and also through the organizational changes we put through, and where we've had the ability to, through the change in process, through the change of operational improvements, we were able to we've reduced on the top end of our organization, where we reduced the number of deputy managers by 2 over the last 3 years. We've decreased the number of directors by 2 and reduced the number of management staff within the organization by 17 over 2 years, and that's a direct result of the continuous improvement program in line with the other organizational changes we've made. We haven't actually come out and done a specific CI report per se. Ms. Lambert did, I believe 2 years ago, provided the update to council on some of the changes and the impacts of those, but that's one thing we can take forward under the new program, whereby we will specifically identify, and where it's easily identifiable, the monetary impact as a result of the change. Sometimes it crosses over an area, so it's a little more difficult to exactly pinpoint the dollar figure, but we can show on the global reductions we've had over a number of years the impact of the program.
And that'd be by department?
Excuse me?
That would be by department?
It can be by department, but we actually tend to look at it because of the way our focus on how we operate the city is more of a global corporate entity versus a siloed department basis. So we recognize a lot of the changes cross boundaries, but there are certain areas like the water area, the water billing piece that are department specific, and we'll identify those where possible.
I think we need to see it by department, yeah.
Where possible.
Show up. Thank you.
Thank you, and I have one more question, and this will be the last one. Councillor Wolf.
Well, I had my life. That's all right.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I was curious about the Visitor Information Center. So you've said when Mr. Fairweather spoke, he didn't mention them as one of the ones that we'd cut. But I would also like to know, in terms of how people come to the city, in the past we'd stop at a visitor center to get a map or find a hotel or a restaurant. And now with everybody with a smartphone, we don't tend to do that. So it's $265,400 if we flatline them. I noticed in the chamber they had $25,000 and something extra money this year for expenses. And looking at their financial report, they're doing very well. I would like to know if we have any stats from them on how many people actually come to the visitor center and what that $265,400 buys us. Is that the rent we pay? I know they put it in under as their revenue, but possibly, I'm not saying cut them completely, but maybe we cut them $20,000, which we gave to the sexual assault center, just to examine how this service is being used and if it's still as valuable as it once was.
Thank you. I'll let Mr. Dyke address that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through to Councillor Wolf, and also in part to Councillor Leggett's questions. We'll pull this information together for the Thursday morning meeting directly. One thing with respect specifically to the Visitor Information Center, we have a contract on that outward, so Mr. Goodrum is responsible for that, and he has the details, so I'll make sure Mr. Goodrum is here on Thursday morning to specifically address the comments around that contract.
And Mayor Craig.
Well, I don't want to get into an argument right at the very end, but I do take exception the word that, in fact, these trips abroad are junkets. They're not junkets. They're business for the city. And we can look at a number of specific results and outcomes, such as Remova setting up in our industrial land base with 500 jobs, which was in fact a result of the trips that were taken by the various mayors over the last decade. I think, too, to sit across the table with the Premier of Ontario and talking to the Executive Council that makes the decisions for Toyota and all other Toyota enterprises in North America really is reinforcing our position, and I think has a lot of advantage in terms of taking trips to talk to people. If you look at the Tier 1 suppliers for Toyota, you'll notice that Stratford has 6 of the major ones. We only have 1. And I think the main reason is they go to Toyota, they go to Japan every year pretty well, the mayor does. So it's this kind of global kind of concept of connecting up that does have benefits and has to be looked at in its proper weighted sense of actually bringing jobs into the economy here and improving the economic outlook of this community. I think what the mayors have done, I'm talking about my fellow mayors, John Tory, in terms of setting up the IT corridor that we talk about, and other aspects of it is not, in fact, falls under that kind of concept. So I think we got to be careful. That's all I'm asking.
Doug, the point was, or Mr. Mayor, the point was, I'd asked for it last week and did not receive it. That was the point.
Well, I think my point is it's not a junket, okay? That's an old-fashioned term that's got a very kind of, I think, negative tone to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to you, Councillor Devine, I do apologize for not having it today. We have the information. It was finalized today. We'll have it to you right before you leave here and get in your truck to go home, but you will have it today. I do apologize for the delay.
Thank you. I think we all realize the importance of those trips to further develop and bring economic development into our communities. Councillor Mehta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that on my end, when I went to AMO, I met with the ministers on OMB reform. I was part of that committee. So when I go on the conferences, like all of you, I make use of my time there, not only to promote the city and to network and hear from other councils about what they're doing, and of course to learn at the seminars, like to learn, right, so that as a councillor I can do a better job. But also I make an effort to talk to the ministers as well, and they're neat meetings. Like I had met with the Attorney General when I was there, and about getting some progress moving in this direction. So that was a very good meeting, very well spent. And I'm not saying that there may not necessarily, there might be a cheaper way of doing things. I'm willing to have that discussion. So I'm not ruling anything out. I just want to say that they are good meetings on my end. And I think with all the councillors, I've seen them in attendance at a lot of the different seminars. And I think, we all learn and we have good discussions about what we learned, and it helps us all do a better job. So thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Craig.
Well, thank you. Just to sort of carry on a bit of a discussion here, I encourage members of council to go on conferences. I think it's really important. Every member of this council comes to the council from a particular point of view. Some really are connected into the athletics of the community, some into women's issues in the community, some into libraries. And when we go to these conferences, we all split up and we go in different directions in terms of what we learn, what seminars we go, and what ideas we bring back. And the other point too is, Dunfield Theatre, you don't just take an application and stick it in a mailbox and hope you get money. It doesn't work that way. It's at these conferences, both federally and provincially, that we get to meet all the ministers and we get to advocate on the applications that we have in. The gas tax is a perfect example of of councillors across the country going to FCM, advocating for money from the federal government on the gas tax, and that's why we've got it, which helps our budget. So these conferences are very important. And we have to weigh in the outcomes of the positive things that happen.
Thank you. Now seeing no other requests or speakers, I'm going to ask for a motion. Oh, 1 second. Go ahead. Okay. Mr. Dyke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And normally I wouldn't do this. I would wait to a council meeting, but unfortunately for us, Mr. Fairweather won't be at the council meeting on the 19th. He's going to be away. But I think it's important for the committee and the people here in the media to recognize that Mr. Fairweather and his team for their efforts in monitoring and guiding our financial state for the city over the last year. Mr. Fairweather was recognized by the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, which is an international organization for financial reporting excellence for the year 2016. That was an award we were going to present to Stephen at the council meeting. Unfortunately, he won't be here, but I thought while he's here, take the time to congratulate him and his team for the outstanding job they do for us.
Certainly, on behalf of the committee and on council and everybody in the audience, I know I congratulate you, Mr. Fairweather, for that accomplishment. Well done and congratulations. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Councillor Reid, seconder.
Yes, moved by myself, seconded by Mayor Craig, that the council meeting is now adjourned at 2:05 p.m.
Thank you. Those in favor? Adjourned.